All right, welcome everybody to the Global PhysEd Voxcast. I'm really excited to be interviewing Dr. Peter Gray this morning. So Dr. Gray, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. How are you this morning?
I'm good, thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much. I'm a big fan of your work. I've probably watched your TED Talk about 1,000 times. And I share it with everybody that I can because I think play is such an important part of our development and our education. And a lot of times that's lacking. So I wanted to get started by talking about some of your background. So you're an evolutionary psychologist, and I was wondering, how did you get interested in the evolution of human nature?
Well, I've long been interested in the evolution of human nature. I think I began to get interested in that way back when I was a college student. I actually began to read Darwin's original work and began to think a lot about the evolution of human beings. Most of my early research was not so explicitly evolutionary on human beings. I was for a long time doing research on the brain, studying mice and rats and the binding of certain hormones in the brain. It was really in the early 1980s, I was already fairly far along in my career, that I began to get interested in children's development and play from an evolutionary perspective. And that interest came about in part, actually in fairly large part, because of my own son, who was rebelling in school, and we found an alternative for him. And in that alternative was a place where children play and explore in their own ways, and I became fascinated by how children learn in that kind of a setting. And that's really when I began to turn my attention to the study of play and other aspects of children's ways of learning about the world around them and practicing the kinds of skills that they need to do well in the world.
So in your TED Talk, which again I've watched a million times, you talk about play being in our nature, and in your research, in your study of evolution, what are some of the evolutionary functions of play?
Well, yeah, play actually serves quite a number of functions, I'm convinced. The primary function of play, not just for human beings, but for all mammals, is to practice the skills that are crucial for survival. So you can predict pretty much what a young mammal will play at by knowing what are the main constraints to that animal's survival. So predators play at predation. They play at stalking and pouncing or chasing, depending on the kind of predator. Whereas prey animals play at dodging and darting and getting away from predators. And I could run through other kinds of examples, but it's pretty clear that animals, by and large, play at the kinds of skills that they need to develop to survive and do well in the environment that they're growing up in. Not surprisingly, from that point of view, we human beings, our children, play more than any other mammals do when they're free to. It's also presumably why we have such a long period of childhood. We have a long period of childhood because we need a long period of time to play to acquire the kinds of skills that we need. We need a long period of time in which we are cared for. Our survival needs are sort of cared for so that we can play and explore and acquire the kinds of skills that we need. If you look at children's play across cultures, and you look, unfortunately, our culture, you can't look too much because we have taken away play from children. It's tragic, and that's something that I've written about a great deal, and we'll talk about here. But if you look at any traditional culture, certainly if you look at hunter-gatherer cultures, I've done a study of surveying anthropologists who've studied hunter-gatherer cultures. what you find is that children spend most of their time playing and exploring from the age of 4, when they're kind of regarded as no longer infants, can run off away from their mom and play with the other kids, up until the mid to late teenage years. Children are in traditional and hunter-gatherer cultures playing a great deal of time. In some of the farming cultures, they've got a fair amount of work to do, but they still play, even in the context of that work. So so if you look at any of these people, what you find is children play in the whole set of ways that you would predict that they would play based on knowing what human beings have to learn. So we, like other mammals, need to acquire physical strength and skills and grace of movement. And so no surprise, children are playing everywhere. They play at chasing and climbing and wrestling and all kinds of things that promote the body's development. Mm-hmm. They also play in these physical ways in risky ways, as do other mammals. And what are they doing when they're doing that? They're learning courage. They're practicing the ability to experience a certain amount of fear, but they're in control of that fear. That's the difference between when children are doing it. So they're climbing that tree as high as they can climb without feeling terror, feeling just enough fear that is kind of thrilling. I feel this thrill of a certain amount of fear, but I'm still in control. And that's how it turns out that other mammals do the same thing. They play in risky ways. And what evolutionary theorists have concluded is that the reason they play in risky ways is all of us, all mammals, are going to, at some point in our lives, face real dangers. And if that's the first time we have felt a strong feeling of fear, and we haven't practiced feeling that and controlling our body and our mind, while that, we might have a panic attack and we might die, or our child might die. We might not be able to respond appropriately. So children are practicing physical skills. They're practicing courage in that kind of physical way. But think of all the other ways they're playing. They're playing with language. Language is learned in play. Nobody teaches children their native language. They play with it. The first cooing and babbling of infants, the first use of words are always done in a playful context. And as children grow older, they play in more complex ways with language. They play, we're the animal with opposable thumbs that builds our environment. Children everywhere play at building things. Constructive play is a universal variety of play. What children build depends on the culture in which they're growing up. Mm-hmm. Children everywhere play in that kind of way. We play, as do other mammals, socially. No matter how else we're playing, kids want to play with other kids. Well, learning to get along with other people, learning to negotiate differences, learning how to control your anger, and how to get your needs met while also meeting the needs of your playmate. These are incredibly important skills, especially for human beings. And so it's no surprise that our children are driven to play with other children. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the ways that children play. And if you match that on to the kinds of skills that human beings everywhere have to learn, it matches pretty well. And from an evolutionary perspective, that's no surprise. That's what you would expect. It's also the case that children play at the specific kinds of skills that are important to their culture. So children all over the world play in these ways that I've just described, because these are important to people everywhere. Mm-hmm. But what you find is that in a hunter-gatherer culture, for example, children play with bows and arrows and fire and digging sticks. And if it's a culture that uses dugout canoes, they play at that. If it's a culture that plays particular musical instruments, they play at that. They look around, they see, what is it that people do in my culture? And then they incorporate that into their play. Nobody has to tell them to do that. Certainly nobody has to require them to do it. They just do it because it's natural. Right. In our culture, the big tool, of course, right now is the computer. And so almost no matter what you're going to do when you grow up. Even now, you're going to have to use a computer, and every kid can see that. And in their bones, they know this is the most important tool of our culture today. And so no surprise that children in play are attracted to computers like filings to a magnet, and spend a tremendous amount of time playing with computer and acquiring the kinds of skills that are involved in computer use. So that's kind of a summary of the main function. There are other functions of play too. Play is aggression reducing. Play in adulthood is aggression reducing. You can kind of predict how warlike or peace-like a culture is by knowing how playful the adults are. So I could go on and on about various functions of play, but since we're primarily interested here in children and teens and their play, I would say that it's the acquisition of skills is the primary function of play.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to, get an overview of that, because I think in the school system, what we want to have happen is to prepare our students for, for the real world, so to speak. And it seems like, I've been a teacher for 12 years, that more and more there is this reduction of free play, and there's this idea that it's kind of a waste of time, and it's being taken away more and more from our students. And I'm an elementary school teacher, and I see it more and more in the elementary schools as well. Right. And they're taking that risk away completely. They don't want our kids to be in any kind of danger at any time. So it's almost like this idea of safety above all. And to the detriment of our students. So why do you think that is? Why do you think in the school system that is slowly being taken away?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, let me point out that this decline in children's opportunities to play has been a continuous decline for a long period of time. We're seeing it especially now, but there's good evidence that the beginning around 1955, according to Howard Chudikoff, who's written a book on the history of play in America, that's when we adults began to take away children's freedom in play. I was lucky. I was a kid in the 1950s. And so, when I was a kid, by the time I was 5, I could go anywhere in town on my bike. Yeah. If I went with my 6-year-old friend, I could even go out of town on my bike. So that's unheard of today. The world is no more dangerous today than it was then. The crime rate is not any higher. The crimes against children are down, and so on and so forth. But we believe it's dangerous out there. And so we've developed a kind of a morality that you are not a moral parent if you don't know where your child is all the time. And so what has happened outside of school, as well as in school, but outside of school, is that children are simply not given the freedom to go out and play with other kids away from adults. And away from adults is a big part of it. I'll explain that in a moment. But away from adults, that children all over the world throughout history, except for times of slavery and intense child labor, have enjoyed. Children are designed to learn by playing with other children away from adults. And the reason I emphasize away from adults is because what children learn in play is how to be adults. And if there are adults around, it's hard to learn to be an adult, because the adult is solving all your problems for you. The adult is intervening. The adult is settling your disputes and so on. The adult is telling you what to do. Whereas in play, a huge part of the purpose of play is for children to learn how to create their own activities, to learn how to make their own rules, to learn how to negotiate differences, even to learn how to deal with bullying, to figure out what you do about this. And if there's an adult there solving all these problems for you, moreover, if that adult there is telling you, don't climb the tree, it's too dangerous, you're just taking away all the value of play. So there's a lot of reasons this change has occurred. I think, for one thing, I don't think anybody in the past particularly thought about the value of play. It's just, when I was a kid, I'm not sure that our parents sent us out, go out and play because they believed play is such a good thing. They just wanted us out of the house,
Right.
right? And they wanted, they didn't want us in their way. They didn't want, houses were smaller then, but throughout the world, it was just assumed this is what children do. And I don't think anybody gave a lot of thought. It's like if you're a fish, you don't give a lot of thought to water, right? And if you're a family where kids play all the time, you don't give a lot of thought to play. This is just what they do. It's like they breathe and they play, and you don't have to give much thought to it. But we began taking play away for a number of reasons. One is the increased fears in our society. There were, as the media became, became a more powerful source and began to sort of publicize those cases where something bad did happen to a child who wasn't watched. Of course, bad things can happen. We've got with millions and millions of people, something bad is going to happen every day. That statistically, the chance it'll happen to any given child is extremely small, but it's not zero, and it can happen. And then it gets played up by the media, and then people begin to think this is much more common than it actually is. And once you have this vision of some terrible thing that could happen to your child, then it's hard to just send your child out to play. So that's part of it. We went through a period in the mid to late 1980s, where you would hear public service announcements that were like, do you know where your child is now? And you were presumably a negligent parent if you didn't. I mean, when I was a kid, parents didn't want to know where their kids are, and the kids certainly didn't want their parents to know. So, but that changed. That changed beginning around the 1980s. I also think that, and school has played a big role in it. So the media, the experts' warnings, the increased litigiousness of our society, the threat that you will, if somebody gets hurt in your yard, they might sue you. So people don't want kids playing in their strange kids playing, kids other than your own kids playing in the yard, and so on. Parks, cities got concerned about legal suits if kids got hurt in the playground, so they took away all the interesting playground equipment.
Yeah, the monkey bars. The monkey bars are illegal.
Monkey, all kinds of things. The old-fashioned Ferris wheel, merry-go-rounds that you would push, they've been taken away. All kinds of things have been taken away. The typical public playground is boring for anybody beyond the age of about 5 today. And even for 5-year-olds, it gets boring pretty quick because all the fun has been taken out of it. So that's part of it. And I also have to add the increased weight of school. School has become a much bigger deal over time. Just to give you an example, when I was a kid in the 1950s, in elementary school, there was no homework. Once in a while, a teacher might ask us to write a poem or a story at home and bring it in the next day, something kind of creative, but never did we carry books or worksheets back and forth. Parents were not involved in the school situation. School occurred at school, and when you were home, you were free to play and explore. You might have some chores at home, but you were not in school when you were home. The school year was shorter when I was a kid. We had 5 more weeks of vacation from school. I've looked that up, actually. The school year has increased by 5 weeks since the 1950s. Recess has been taken away largely, certainly greatly diminished. When I was, I don't know if this is true for every elementary school I went to, because I went to a number of schools, but I do remember very well 5th and 6th grade, we had 6-hour school days, which is kind of typical even today. But we were outdoors for 2 hours of those 6 hours. We were only inside for 4 hours a day, never more than an hour at a time. We had half-hour recess in the middle of the morning, half-hour recess in the middle of the afternoon, and a full hour at lunch. And we could do whatever we wanted during those periods. Nobody was watching us. We could go running off into the woods. We could go home. Some people went home for lunch, but most people stayed around because they wanted to play instead. So, so think of the difference. I mean, now if a kid can't sit for more than an hour and focus on homework, they're given some kind of a diagnosis, right? I mean, they're regarded as mentally ill. Nobody when I was in elementary school, nobody expected kids to be able to do that, right? So we have gone berserk. Frankly, we've gone berserk with schooling. We've gone absolutely berserk. There's no evidence at all that all this focus we're putting on school and the amount of time and starting kids early, there's no evidence at all that they're learning more as a result of that. There's a lot of evidence that we are absolutely driving kids crazy with this, literally so. Increased depression, increased anxiety, increased suicide rate, dramatically increased. I've also documented this, and I've presented in my book, Free to Learn, the argument that this is a cause-effect relationship, that what we have done to children by taking play away from them, by putting them in these continuously anxiety-provoking situations, these tedious school situations, we are quite literally driving quite a number of kids crazy.
Dr. Gray, are you familiar with the 4 C's of education? Have you ever heard this before? Creativity, collaboration, communication, and critical thinking?
I wish those were the 4 C's of our education, but these are the C's that we take away in school, right?
It's really funny that now there's this push to get those 4 C's back in school. There's the push for this, and yet we took away the opportunity where those 4 C's are being done in an unstructured environment. Can you talk about the research of how play increases creativity or collaboration or communication?
Well, you know, first of all, these 4 C's can't be taught. But we can take them away from people, and that's what we're doing in our schools. They can't be taught. They're learned through practice and experience, and play is the primary route of practice and experience through which children learn these things. Even to the degree that there was, you know, as I said, when I was a kid, sometimes we would write poems or stories, and we would have art classes. And there was a certain amount of creativity involved in those kinds of things. Even those things are largely being taken away from schools today because they're not part of the standardized tests, and so much focus is on these multiple choice standardized tests. But absolutely, and these are the things all play is creative. And children are born creative. Look at any little kids, and they're being creative all the time. Talk about critical thinking. You know how people talk about the summer slide in academic skills? Supposedly children lose academic skills during the summer. So I was wondering about that. There are certain things about children in schooling that become myths, and I was wondering, is this kind of a myth about this academic slide? So I actually looked into the research. I've got a fairly recent blog post on this, that the actual studies show that the main academic slide that occurs is in mathematics, and it's in mathematical calculation, the kind of thing nobody does anymore. The mechanics of doing long division and doing it properly and so on and so forth. That does decline somewhat over the summer, although it's picked up very rapidly at the beginning of the next year. But there's some of the tests that have examined the academic side have separated mathematical reasoning, the kind of critical thinking that goes with mathematics, compared to calculation. That actually increases during the summer at a faster rate than it does during the school year. To me, no surprise at all, because in the summer you're doing real things, and in your play, you're in our culture, you can't get away from numbers. You are undoubtedly learning using numbers in some real world way, and you are acquiring the ability to think about numbers, to be able to reason about numbers, to be the more important thing, especially today, now that everybody's carrying a calculator in their pocket. The more important thing than calculation is to know what it means to multiply, what it means to divide. Well, if you're a kid playing baseball, calculating baseball averages, or if you're in the kitchen cooking for fun and you're doing fractions, You're learning what it means to divide, what a fraction means. If you're painting, helping your parents paint the house, and you're calculating how much paint you need, you're figuring out what it means to multiply to calculate the number of square feet and how many, So real life is how you learn critical thinking in relation to anything, including mathematics.
So if we're looking at this in the lens of a school system, and we're looking at solutions for the school system, I know you're a big proponent of self-directed education. Could you talk a little bit about what self-directed education is, and maybe even how we can start implementing some of those strategies in our school system?
Yeah, I think, well, self-directed education is the education that comes from a person's self-chosen activities. Not all of it, most of it is not explicitly for education. Most of it is just in the course of life. You're playing, you're exploring, you're solving the problems that occur. And in the process of doing all that, you're picking up you're practicing skills, you're picking up information, and you remember it because you're picking it up in the context of real life. It's meaningful to you. So that kid who's learning to divide because he wants to be able to calculate his batting average, he's going to remember how to divide. He's going to remember what it even means to divide. The kid who's learning it just to pass a test at school is going to forget it as soon as the test is over. That's why there's the summer slide in that stuff you learn in school, right? So things that you do because you really want to do it, and because it's part of your real life, even things that are hard because you figure out, I've got to do this to do the things I want to do, you remember those things. Mm-hmm. So that's self-direct. All of us, most of our education, no matter how much schooling we had, came from self-directed education. Most of what you know now came from your actual living in this world, not from what you learned in school. So self-directed education with capital letters, self-directed education, is sort of the brand that I've coined for those people who've made the decision that all of their kids' education is going to be self-directed. The contrast to self-directed education is what the more gentle word for it would be imposed education. The stronger word for it would be forced education, coerced education. And our school system is based on a system of coerced education. And so you make children go to school. You make them do these lessons. Because you believe that everybody has to learn these things on a certain schedule, all at the same time. Everybody's got to learn the same stuff at the same time and do it in the same way, pretty much, right? And that's simply never going to happen naturally. There's no way you can have more than a few kids in a room, more than a couple of kids in a room, and everybody's going to have the same interests at the same time. So the only way you can get them to do it is to force them to do it. And you force them to do it with reward and punishment. So the entire system is based on reward and punishment. Substituting the natural drive to learn. You're taking away curiosity, you're taking away playfulness, you're taking away sociability, wanting to know what your friends know and all of that, and you're substituting reward and punishment. And reward and punishment, you can get people to do things with reward and punishment. What is the punishment? The punishment is shame. The punishment is shame. If you don't do as well as your classmates are, you feel ashamed. The reward is hubris. If you do better than your classmates do, you feel, oh, I'm better than them. I feel good. That's what we're doing to kids in school, and that's the basis for education. I feel that is very, very harmful. Not just is it wasting time because the children aren't learning stuff that they remember, but also it's creating a very bad psychological attitude that the purpose in life is to be better than other people. The entire school system is based on that. And then even outside of school, we put children when children are just playing their own games, they're not particularly competitive, even if it's a pseudo-competitive game. Those old-fashioned pickup games, nobody cared in the end who won or lost. It was all about having fun. It was all about stretching your skills and doing the best you can, but you didn't really care if you won or lost. First of all, the teams were arbitrary. You just chose them up. But now we put kids into adult-directed sports, and it's all about winning or losing. It's the damn trophy. Are you the star or not the star? This is not good for our society. This is really not good for human beings. It's not good for our society.
So, Dr. Gray, there's so many points in your last response there, and PhysEd. We are trying to go with, happiness and joy for movement, and moving away from this idea that if you don't do the skill, that you're not good enough to play the activity anymore. Trying to
Right.
refocus that. Before I get to like 17 things you talked about, can we go back to how school's set up and the self-directed learning? Are you familiar with unschooling? The idea that
Yes, I have actually done research on unschooling. I've studied grown unschoolers. I've done a survey of unschooling families, so I know why they do it and how they do it, and I have some evidence on the consequences of unschooling by surveying adults who were themselves unschooled.
All right, so I guess my question is two things. Can you tell the listeners, because most people probably don't know what unschooling is, and then second, for me, one of the issues I have is a parent has to not work, and in society right now, for the most part, we have two parents working there, so school needs to be there for a place where parents can put their kids in, I'm going to say safe area, that's debatable these days.
Right.
How can a school system incorporate the parts of unschooling that you think are positive, if you do think there is positives?
Okay, so first of all, let me tell you, for people who haven't heard the term unschooling, officially people who are unschoolers are homeschoolers. There's no official designation, government designation of unschoolers. So to satisfy the compulsory education requirement in our culture, if you're going to unschool your child, you have to register as a homeschooler. Most school districts allow you to use what's called an informal methodology in homeschooling, which basically means that you are allowing the child to pursue his or her own interests within the homeschooling context. You're not enforcing a curriculum as the parents. You're allowing the children to follow their own interests. And you as the parents, you're right, it does take not every family is going to be able to do this, because it does take a family that has the resources and time and opportunity to facilitate their child's learning. For those families that do it, it doesn't take necessarily a lot of money. In fact, there's some evidence that the average family income for people who do unschooling is actually less than the average family income for people in the United States, considerably less. Partly because they've made a life choice. They've made a life choice that they're more interested in time, family time, and less interested in money and material things. So they typically would have only one income, or maybe both are working but part-time, so that they can be, or maybe they're working in a way that they're working from home. They're making that kind of a choice. So they're more interested in the quality of life and in the family life than they are in having a lot of material goods, and they certainly are not interested in status, the kinds of jobs that are require a lot of your time and might be regarded as a high status job. So that's the choice that they've made. So what about for people who the self-directed education is available, however, for people who don't homeschool. There are schools that are for self-directed education. So my original research was at the Sudbury Valley School. It's a school that's about to celebrate its 50th anniversary. It's been around for a long time. it is certified as a school. So the one requirement is that children have to be there, have to check in a certain number of days to satisfy the minimum number of days requirement. But the way this school operates is that children are free to pursue their own interests all day long. They're not segregated by age. There are children there from age 4 on through what would be high school age someplace else, through the mid to late teens. And there's all kinds of opportunities for learning, but there's nobody making you do anything, and there's nobody testing you. It is up to you. You are in charge of your own life in this setting. The staff members don't call themselves teachers because they don't believe they do any more teaching than anybody else. So this is a school designed for self-directed education. There are now dozens of schools modeled after the Sudbury Valley School, and there are now a new sets of schools, agile learning centers and so on, that have become incorporated as schools. They meet the legal requirements of schools. It depends somewhat. You have to convince the state or the local school board, depending on what state you're in, how the mechanism is. These schools operate for at a considerably less expense than the public schools operate, typically about half the cost of public schools in terms of the total cost of operation. So there's economically, they're quite feasible. Some of the schools have sliding tuition scales all the way down to zero tuition, because they believe that it's important that they be available to people regardless of their economic situation of their family. So these are becoming more and more common. At this point, there are not nearly as many students in such schools as there are unschoolers. There are actually a lot of unschoolers. There's something like 200,000 unschoolers in the United States right now. Children who are of school age who are being homeschooled by the method of unschooling. There's not that many children in Sudbury model schools, but there's a growing number of them. So this is rising. This is increasing. Every time the government, every 4 years, the Department of Education does another survey of where kids are in school. And every time they do it, a higher percentage of them are doing homeschooling, and a higher percentage of the homeschoolers are using informal methods. And I think part of the reason for this is because of the increased toxicity of the public schools. So more and more people are recognizing that the public school is hurting their child. They're seeing the consequences. They're seeing bright little kids going off to school and becoming gradually dulled, becoming anxious, becoming depressed. And they're taking them out to homeschool, and then they realize that they don't need to give a curriculum because the kids want to learn. And if you let them learn what they want to learn, they learn so much better and quicker. So the homeschooling becomes unschooling.
Yeah, and negative behaviors go down when you're not forcing people to do things they don't want to do. It's just natural.
That's right. I mean, ADHD becomes a non-issue for most people. There are a few people who I think actually are so impulsive that it interferes with other aspects of their life. But the fact, right now, 20% of boys in school at some point in their school career get a diagnosis of ADHD, and most of them are given powerful drugs. One study I did was to ask homeschoolers about their kids who had diagnosed with ADHD when they were in school, what happened when they took them out of school, and in almost every case, they were able to take them off the drugs. The kids do fine. They can pursue their own interests without those drugs. It's just that there are some kids, mostly more boys than girls, who simply are not able or willing. I think it almost has to do more with willing than able to sit and do boring stuff hour after hour in school. And they get that diagnosis. But at home, they don't have to do that. They pursue their own interests. They can focus on the things they're interested in.
And that's why all the research into how long can we focus on something and attention, every time I look it up, nobody can give you a definitive number, because when you're not interested, it could be 30 seconds. And when you're interested, you could do something for 2 hours.
Right. But one of the staff members at the Sudbury Valley School tells me that the kids who come with a diagnosis of ADHD they go off the drugs. He says, if anything, they suffer from hyper focus. They are more focused. He thinks that their problem in school is they focus so much on the things they're interested in that they're not willing to be distracted by what the teacher wants to distract them onto.
Right.
That's true for some of them. Others of them, I think, they have the kinds of minds that kind of want to embrace everything at once. And that's advantageous in some settings, but not in the standard school setting.
So Dr. Gray, yeah, I've recently kind of learned a little bit about microschools and those kind of popping up all over the place. And it seems like, some of these ideas you can do in an alternative setting like a microschool or a school that, is a little bit different from the current school system. Do you have any suggestions for the current school system and how we could kind of incorporate some of these ideas in what we're currently doing in the school system?
Right. One thing I would recommend to you and to listeners is look up Michael Hinds. He's a superintendent of schools for the Patchogue Medford School District on Long Island. He has really taken seriously the problems of school, and within the context of a public school system, he's trying to do as much as he can to solve that problem. For one thing, he is backing the parents who are in the opt-out movement, the parents who are saying, we don't want our children to take standardized exams. And so something like over half the kids in that district are now not taking the standardized exams. He's giving teachers more freedom to use their judgment with kids, to allow more freedom of movement in the school, to get away from all this focus on test drill and so on. He has increased recess. He has also brought in yoga and various kinds of relaxation techniques and so on and so forth into the curriculum. This is all in elementary school. There are 7 elementary schools in his district. And most interesting to me is let me just digress a moment before I come back to that, but one of the things I have been trying, whenever I speak to groups of public school teachers, I make to administrators, I make the case that, school could be a great place for free age-mixed play. That period of time when the school day ends until parents are home from work, from 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, whenever the school day ends, until 5 or 6 o'clock, the school could open up for free play. Make use of the outdoor playground, the gymnasium. If there's a swimming pool, use that, the art supplies, everything in the school, age mixed play, all grades together, playing together, for those kids who aren't going home right then. And this would solve the babysitting problem for parents, and it would provide several hours a day, a substantial amount of real free play. And it wouldn't be very expensive to do, in theory at least, because the equipment is all there. You would need, in this day and age, you would need at least a couple of adults, and you'd probably need maybe some teenagers who are there just to make sure that things are safe enough. And the adults and teenagers would have to be trained not to intervene too much, to allow the kids to really play, but be there kind of the way a lifeguard is there on the beach. If there's a serious problem, you solve it. But to a large extent, you let the kids be. Well, so far, no school district has taken us up on that, but Michael Hinds is interested in doing that. And he's started off small. It turns out there are all kinds of bureaucratic problems for doing anything in the schools. But he started off small with just one morning a week of free play before school. It turns out there are a fair number of kids who are left off early anyway, and they didn't have much to do, or there would be sometimes some formal activity for them. So he said, let's one day a week, let's start it off small. We'll have free play in the morning for an hour before school starts. And he's now been doing that this past year, and it's working out beautifully, better than anybody predicted. Kids who aren't normally left off early are asking to be left off early. Believe it or not, they want their mom to get them up early and get them to school early so they can play.
That's funny.
And I was first afraid, for some legal requirement, that you have to have teachers. You can't just bring in some other lower paid person to do this. You have to have teachers being the monitors. And I was a little bit afraid that teachers would not be able to prevent themselves from teaching, that they could not prevent themselves from intervening and correcting the children and solving problems. But it turns out that with some instruction, they are really following that. Their job is to be an observer. The way I like to say it is that for the time that you're out there watching the kids, you're not a teacher, you're not responsible for them unless there's something very seriously happen. Just kind of imagine that you are a naturalist watching some species of animal, and you're trying to learn about them. You're trying to understand the amazing things that these creatures can do. And that apparently that's working out. The teachers are learning about the kids by seeing them in a different context. They're admiring the kids. They're sometimes seeing that same kid who looks kind of stupid in the classroom is actually quite brilliant out there in the playground. There are kids who are social rejects in their own classroom, but they're making friends with kids of a different age and they're acquiring social skills. There are parents love this thing so much because the kids are coming home happier. The parents are asking for more of it, and they're raving about it on Facebook. So now parents in other school districts are asking their superintendents, "Can't we have this too?" So this is, to me, a model of what can be done. And I have to admire Michael Hinds a great deal. He, by the way, has a TEDx talk himself. And so I would recommend, you might not want to even get him on your program at some point, but he is somebody who I see as sort of stretching the boundaries of what you can do within the public school system.
There's so much. Again, I can't believe we only have an hour because I could ask follow-ups to everything you talk about. I've always thought grouping kids by age is a horrible idea.
Oh boy, I agree with that.
And then when you talk about socialization, if you have kids who are in fourth grade who are into Pokemon, or fifth grade or something that the other kids look weird, but the second and third graders are into it, those relationships are really beneficial to both kids in that area. Like I said, I could go on forever about your last points. My question to you now, switching over a little bit. I'm paid to work within a system, and that system says I need to teach the students standards. I have a little flexibility being a non-tested area that I could choose the power standards that are really important, but I have a job to do. So I'm trying to work within the system. As a PhysEd teacher, how can we use the idea of structured play but still accomplish all the goals of not micromanaging them? What advice would you have for me to work within the system that I'm given, that I don't have much flexibility of, hey, just go choose what you want, although I do have a little bit of leeway within that?
Let me tell you a little bit of background that might prejudice a little bit my response. I hated phys ed as a kid. I was something of an athlete. I was a varsity basketball player and baseball player. I hated phys ed, as did almost everybody else. And why did I hate it? Because it's so structured and so boring and so, and for anybody, even though I was a pretty good athlete, there were some things I was terrible at. I never had very strong arms. So you climb those ropes to the ceiling. And I couldn't do it, and I'm embarrassed that I can't do it. And I hear from girls these days who, in fact, I know people who've dropped out of school because of phys ed. It bothers them more than anything else in school. There they are. They're being required to do these things in front of everybody. When you're testing yourself, when you want to climb a tree, you want to do it only with your best friends. Or you don't want people there who are going to possibly mock you and tease you for it and so on. Now, I'm not saying you're doing that, but I'm saying that this happens in phys ed, and it's still happening in phys ed, that the worst opportunity to try anything new, including physical challenging things, is in front of other people. That's such a stressful situation. It's a terrible place to learn to read, and it's a terrible place to learn physical skills. You want it to be fun and joyful, and you want people to challenge themselves, not to be challenged by somebody else, especially by an authority figure who's making it seem like this is something that you've got to do, that you should be able to do, and so forth. So I don't know the full answer to your question, but let's say that when you talk about semi-structured sports, let's say, here's another thing that I've been trying to promote, although I haven't been thinking about it in the schools. There are, and I've heard of a couple of people who've tried this thing within the context of youth sports in the community. So you have every community's got these adult-directed sports, which I argue are not play because there's an adult in charge of it, and you're not learning the things that you normally learn in play, how to create your own activities, create your own rules, and so on. But so I've argued, at least add to that set of options something that might be called the Sandlot experience. So you go there to the Sandlot experience, and the equipment is there. The equipment is there for a variety of different games, and you can do whatever game you want. But you and whoever else wants to do this, you've got to create the game yourself. You've got to figure out the rule. You've got to make your rules. You've got to figure out how you're going to do it. You've got to play that game. Now, I don't know if there's time within the space of the PhysEd period to do something like that. But suppose you had this, since you've got to have some requirements, I suppose if it's going to occur, you can't just have people there on their iPhone, or if that's what they would rather do. But suppose that you've got the requirement that they do some physical thing, but you give them a choice, and they can do what they want, and they can, but they have to sort of, if it's going to be a game of some sort, they have to sort of create it themselves. I don't know if that's feasible or not. I don't know if
it is
time to do it. Yeah,
that's exactly it, because we're also in charge of the social emotional learning piece. And
yeah.
You said about the harm that we're doing in our class to the future, and the association with movement being so negative because of physical education is doing harm that's lasting 40, 50 years. We have contributed to the obesity epidemic simply because we have not created that positive association with movement, which should be first.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and I think, like Justin was saying, we could definitely focus more on the affective domain in physical education, and that's what I've kind of been shifting more towards, where we're looking at things like how they play with others, how they create these social bonds with their friends, and the secondary things, and I do a lot of self-evaluation. So the secondary things might be the psychomotor stuff. So how you throw a ball, how you catch, those types of things. But the primary objective is playing well with others.
The other thing that I think would help on all of these things to help physical education would be age mixing. If you had kids of various ages together, people playing in whatever way they want. My observation of age mixed play is everybody's stretching their skills, but it becomes less competitive. It becomes less, and the older kids are scaffolding the younger kids up into higher levels of activity. If physical education could be age mixed, I think that would go a long way towards reducing the sense of competition, increasing the kind of creativity and the social interaction that occurs in the process of it.
Yeah, and one of the things that we did at my school, it was last year, we had a mix it up recess day where we mixed up the different age groups and the different grade levels, and the older kids absolutely loved it. I was kind of expecting the fifth graders to kind of be like, well, we don't want to play with the kindergartners, but they absolutely loved it, and there was a different dynamic that the fifth graders had with the younger kids. They were very nurturing with them, and they showed them how to play these games, and I thought it was amazing. I'd love to do that more.
Yeah, I think what happens is that it really is true, contrary to what most people think. The older kids love the little kids, and the little kids, of course, love the older kids. And Younger kids are sort of naturally, in some ways, more creative. They are, and in some ways, they sort of bring out the creativity in the older kids. So it goes in both directions. Younger kids, older kids love to horseplay with younger kids, and younger kids love it. All kinds of roughhousing and piggyback rides and all of those kinds of things become possible, and they are certainly physically, they're physically strenuous activities for both parties.
So I know we're kind of getting to the end here of the hour, and I wanted to really quickly get your take on video games, because I know that's another thing that comes up a lot, especially in the physical education world, where there's some people who think that video games are having a negative effect on our kids and on our youth. That comes up a lot with parents. It comes up a lot with teachers trying to get video games away from our children and away from the school system. What do you think the overall effect is with a student who really enjoys video games and that kind of being taken away when they get into school?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I have actually written, for people who are interested, the blog. I do a blog for Psychology Today, and I've done actually 5 posts on the question of video games because that question keeps coming up. I'm constantly asked it, so I began to actually examine the research. And it turns out that most of the things that we're afraid of about video games, we don't need to be afraid of. They are that, and most of the research, most of the real research that had been done in a way that's publishable in academic journals shows far more benefits of video games than negative consequences. There's zero evidence that playing violent video games promotes real-world violence. I've written about that. There is a lot of evidence that playing almost every video game improves cognitive skills in one way or another. And in fact, there have been a couple of reviews of the literature, one in the American Journal of Play and a more recent one, I think, in Psych Reviews, that review many studies that show that, well-designed studies that show that the very kinds of cognitive skills that are assessed by IQ tests improve with playing in video games. Ability to hold a lot of information in mind, ability to make quick but accurate judgments, ability to see spatial relationships, and so on. These kinds of skills. In fact, the researchers suggest that there's been no other activity ever found that is as powerful as playing video games in improving those kinds of skills. The first observation was a study that showed that, well, this wasn't the first observation, but one of the first was a study that showed that kids who play a lot of video games have, on average, higher IQs than otherwise similar kids who don't play a lot of video games. And so then the question became, well, is it just that smart kids tend to be attracted to video games more than kids who have lower IQs? So then they began to do these studies with people who don't play video games, oftentimes with girls and young women, because it's hard to find boys who don't play video games. And then you have them, you assign them as part of the study. They have to play this video game for a certain number of hours a week for a certain number of weeks. And lo and behold, their cognitive abilities improve as a result of that. So the whole question of addiction, there's no evidence really that video games are any more addictive than anything else that you get really interested in. Yet, I think if there is a difference, it's this, that video games, there's no end to how challenging a video game can be. You continuously are raising the level, or you're going to a new game. It's always challenging. And you're always in play. You want to be at the cutting edge of your ability. So with checkers, let's say, you reach a point where you really can't get any better at checkers. You know it all, right? But with video games, that's not true. There's no end to it. And so it's always challenging. The video games are increasingly social. They're playing them online. When kids are together, they're playing physically together. They're talking about the video games. one of my so my conclusion about video games is video games as they're played today they're creative, they kind of have all the values of play with the exception of they're not physically strenuous. You could say, of course, the same thing about reading. They're not physically strenuous, and I do think it's really important for kids to get outdoors and to play in more physical ways, and I do believe that kids would be outdoors playing in more physical ways if we allowed them to do so. Mm-hmm. And if we take away their outdoor play, and now we take away their video games, we're taking away play, period.
Right, that's an excellent point. So, Dr. Gray, I know we're at the end of the hour, and I really appreciate your time with us. Thank you so much for coming on the show. There's so many great things that you've talked about in this last hour, and I'll definitely put a link in our show notes to your blog and your TED Talk so people can check that out as well. And I want to leave you with the last word. So, if you have a final message for our audience, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, well, I don't have anything. I think I've covered the ground. I don't want to get on another soapbox in this, but I really, I guess my final word is this: that our children today absolutely need more play. Play is not a luxury. Play is a necessity for children's development. What children learn in play is more important than what they learn in school. And so we must not deprive children of play for the sake of more schooling.
Okay, awesome message. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Dr. Gray.
Thank you.